Are you an all or nothing person, or is it just how you've learned to respond to situations? Hi, my name's Clara, I'm the ExerPsych, and in this video I'm going to talk to you about whether I think that the all or nothing mindset is something that we are simply born with, or if it's something that we learn over time, which therefore implies that we might be able to change. Now, the context for this video is that typically in sort of colloquial language, we often talk about how we are all or nothing people, and this often comes from people who are very type A, like myself included. I'll put my hand up first. And it's often the sense that when we commit to something, we are all in, but when something goes wrong, we might like completely abandon a task, or perhaps even put off starting unless we are certain that like every single condition for it to be perfect has been met. And very often, a lot of people approach an all or nothing mindset with what we call a rigid mindset in psychology, or a fixed mindset, a sense that this is simply who they are and that they won't be able to change it no matter how hard they try. Now, my argument to that, and my argument, I guess, against that would be to suggest or to offer this idea that the all or nothing mindset is simply a way of responding to situations that we have learned. And the way that this applies to the fitness industry and to our relationship with exercise, or our relationship with food, our relationship with health, our bodies, weight loss, getting stronger, whatever that might be. The idea comes from this fact that when we are very type A people, typically, we come to set ourselves very high standards. And very high standards, not just for what we're trying to accomplish, but also the way in which we're going to accomplish it. So let's just say somebody who is very type A, and I say this very loosely, knowing fully that personality types aren't a thing, but we all kind of colloquially understand what I mean by that. But somebody might come into the fitness industry with a very sort of like type A predisposition. And they might feel like in committing to a gym program that all of the conditions have to be perfect. So they must go to the gym 5 days a week. They must do all of the sessions perfectly. They must burn X number of calories. They must do all of the steps. And on top of that, they must also do X amount of cardio across the week. They must also make sure that the nutrition is on point. And all of this creates a really high set of expectations, which sound lovely on paper. Oh, wouldn't it be great if I could do all that stuff? But in practice, it's really, really difficult. Now, a person who's quite type A typically has quite perfectionistic predispositions, has a tendency to expect that the execution of whatever task that they set for themselves is going to be bang on the money. And so what that means is that there's a huge amount of discomfort that arises when the idea of completing a task without it being perfect is even like contended with, though that's a word, but whatever, when it's even like thought about or contemplated. And because that discomfort is so, often that elicits a huge resistance and an anxiety to even like getting the task started. Same thing goes for even once the kind of tasks and chores or lists have been like started to tick off. If you get going, but you feel that you're going to fail at one of the expectations that you've set for yourself, it very quickly feels like it's pointless to do everything else, because why bother if it's not going to be perfect? And so you can see quite quickly how people might oscillate between being very all or nothing as a learned response to deal with the discomfort of, in my professional experience, not feeling good enough. And I think that is often the root, I guess, cause, if we were to talk in that type of language. The root of where these sorts of thinking patterns emerge often come from a feeling of not being good enough. Now, how that feeling of not being good enough has come to be, there's a whole different story. How we acquire these types of thoughts about ourselves is a much longer process that would be addressed in psychotherapy. But if somebody feels like they're not good enough at their core, what that means is that there's a very high pressure expectation on the goal that they set for themselves. So let's just say that if you don't feel like you're good enough at your core, you might then go out and to almost like counteract that discomfort, set yourself really high standard goals in relation to your body, in relation to how you're going to exercise and the way that you're going to eat, specifically because those things, changing those controllable factors, might make you feel like you are better, that it almost like compensates or gets rid of that feeling of not good enough. If I don't feel like I am lean enough, but I make a plan to get leaner, then immediately that gives me a feeling that discomfort of not feeling enough eventually will be eroded or will be removed. It won't be there anymore, because it will be substituted for this feeling of being enough, the feeling of being enough, being attached to these tangible outcomes that I know I can move towards if I control how much I exercise, control how much I eat, and monitor my physique and my changes over time. Which is all fine and well in paper. However, when we set a goal from a place of insufficiency, of not being enough, what that means is that the expectation or the pressure or the stakes of meeting these goals become really high, because not only are the goals and the fulfillment of these goals there to compensate for the feeling of not being good enough, but the risk in not completing the goals would mean that the feeling of not good enough gets compounded, if that makes sense, right? If I set myself out a goal of accomplishing X, Y, and Z, if I set myself out the goal of losing weight because I feel fat and I feel disgusting, if I don't lose weight, then that confirms that I am fat and that I am disgusting, right? And so that puts even more pressure on that sort of accomplishment of that goal. And so because the place in which that goal is being set from is a place of insufficiency, a place of fear, a place of anxiety, there's a lot of stress that goes into working towards that goal, which means that a lot of mental resources are required to focus on, right? That's where that all energy and then sort of mindset comes in. I'm all in, I'm doing all the things, I'm like going crazy, ticking all the boxes, and it feels good. Of course it feels good, because you can see yourself moving towards taking the steps towards doing things that are gonna move you away from that feeling of not being good enough, right? It's really, really excellent. However, I am certain, and I would bet money on this, that anybody who has set a goal from that particular place, from that place of anxiety, that place of threat, even when they observe themselves smashing it, doing all the things, ticking all the boxes, there's still this, like, I don't know, background scene, almost like a program running anxiety in the background that doesn't allow you to relax, again, because of the way that this goal has been set. There's so much that rides on meeting it, and the consequences of not meeting the goal are personally very meaningful and would be, quite devastating to one's self-esteem. And so as a result of that, it's almost like the conditions and the pressure of being on point, of being all in, are really, really, really high stakes, because the minute that you fall off the wagon or even like have a little bit of a slip, that feeling of not being good enough comes in straight away at such ferocious intensity that, again, it confirms that feeling of not being good enough, which is the feeling that you're originally trying to escape, right? And so we can see how that sets up conditions for somebody, typically a perfectionistic type A type of person, to be completely and utterly fully consumed by the goals that they've set for themselves, until, of course, it gets to a point where it is understandably unsustainable, because nobody can do all the things all the time forevermore, right? But because the goals are set from a place of not being good enough, right? Once the wheels start to fall off, it becomes incredibly distressing. The stress can often compound to become so intolerable that it becomes easier to just press the fuck it button. Now, why? And go into the sort of all or nothing part of that equation. Why is that? Because when we press the fuck it button, very often what is happening is that we are essentially ridding ourselves of the goal that we are comparing ourselves to and observing that we're consistently falling short of, right? If I don't feel good enough for myself, and I've set myself this goal, and I consistently observe myself falling, not quite meeting that goal, and me not meeting that goal is compounding that feeling of me not feeling good enough, right? Then why would I continue to do that, right? It's easy in the short term for me to just get rid of the goals and pretend I don't give a shit than it is for me to contend with the fact that maybe the goal is too much of a stretch, because again, that would risk my self-esteem, feeling useless or worthless. It would risk me not feeling good enough. Again, it's always about that feeling of not being good enough and wanting to avoid coming into contact with that feeling. But of course, by setting goals that we can't meet, we're going to eventually face that feeling, right? And so that is why very often people press the fuck button. That's why very often people, sabotage themselves. They essentially burn off all of their goals, pretend that they don't give a fuck, and carry on with their lives a bit like willy-nilly, like, I don't care, again, because in doing so, they're removing any kind of standards that they might be measuring themselves up against, and removing the possibility that comparison, that downward comparison, would ever occur. Of course, until it gets to a point in which it is obvious that no changes have been made and that no movement forward has been made towards changing things that were maybe giving rise to distress to begin with. Again, I'm thinking, in the most obvious of ways in the fitness industry, if we're talking about weight loss, if I don't feel good enough because I think I'm overweight and I feel fat and disgusting in my body, I set myself all the goals, I start ticking all the boxes, but eventually it's impossible to keep up, and I press the fucking button, I sabotage myself, I pretend I don't give a fuck, I stop going to the gym for 2 weeks, I eat whatever I want, I don't care about nutrition until it gets to a point in which I realize I've not been to the gym for 2 weeks, I've not done the things that I wanted to do, I've not eaten in a way that feels particularly nourishing and good for my body. And then not only do I feel that reality of not meeting my goals, but the feeling of not being good enough is like tripled, not even compounded, it's like exponentially 1,000,000 times worse. And the worst thing about it is that then sets a precondition for me to overstretch myself again in setting goals that are even bigger, that are going to help me almost like guarantee that I'm going to get rid of that disgusting feeling of distress within myself. And this is that all or nothing spiral that we learn to essentially like add to as we move through life, only because we've learned to respond to distress by avoiding it. We've learned to respond to discomfort by avoiding it, avoiding the distress of not and the discomfort of not feeling good enough by setting goals that far outreach, like far almost like exceed our current capacities to meet them, and in afterwards when we can't meet those goals, by pressing the fuck it button. And so that's why I really always challenge this idea that like it's not that somebody's an all or nothing person, right? We might be more or less predisposed to being more prone to, you know, perfectionism, more prone to being a bit more rigid, but it doesn't mean that it's a fixed thing, because actually the cycle that I just described, that is, when I say easily disrupted, it's a simple disruption. It's not an easy thing to psychologically do, but it's not impossible at all to break that pattern. And so that all or nothing cycle, the being all or nothing, the all or nothing mindset, is something that we learn to do, not because we deliberately go out of our way to learn to be all or nothing. No one wakes up and goes, oh, I can't wait to be super extreme and like be super on it or super off it. Like that's quite exhausting when you've done it for decades over and over and over, right? Not a fun time. But it's something that we learn to do by virtue of no one teaching us how to consider some of those challenging emotions, right? We just avoid, because what else would you do when you don't know what to do with those difficult feelings of not being good enough? It's such a difficult thought and feeling to experience, the shame that comes with it, etc., especially in the context of health and fitness, where there are so many societally imposed expectations that really kind of glorify the fit person, the healthy body, the the lean specific body, the low body fat body, the person who gets up early and who works out all the time, the person who's consistent, the person who eats vegetables, etc., etc. And so again, it really is worth thinking about whether the all or nothing mindset is something that is fixed, or actually something that is completely malleable, that is something that is a response that comes off the back of the pressures of not knowing how to contend with uncomfortable thoughts and feelings that we end up avoiding, and therefore brings up the really, I guess for me, exciting solution of knowing that the moment that we can learn to contend with those thoughts and feelings that are there as opposed to avoiding them, the moment that we start to be able to acknowledge them, allow them in, accommodate them, to accept them more broadly, to actually work with those difficult things, that actually there's a space in there to be able to disrupt that cycle, to be able to interject it with points of self-acceptance, points of self-compassion that will allow us to learn to be more comfortable with that middle ground, be more comfortable perhaps with contending with the thought that maybe I'm not perfect. Like, well, what if I'm not enough? Can I hold that feeling? Can I experience that feeling? Can I allow myself to be in the presence of that? Can I allow myself to set myself a set of goals and maybe fall short? What is that like for me? And can I learn the tools to be able to contend with that? And in doing so, every single time that I've seen it in my applied work, in doing so, in contending with all of that, coming to a point in which it's not that I'm all in or I'm all out, it's I'm doing enough that it works for me, and I can continue to show up in line with my values, in line with what is kind for me, without finding that health and fitness is something that either completely consumes every waking moment of my life because I am so immersed in it, or something that consumes every waking moment of my life in the back of my head because I am so avoidant of the goals that I thought I'd set for myself, but actually I'm not able to meet right now. So I hope that this video gives you a bit of food for thought. I'd love to hear any reflections that come off the back of it. And if you want to hear more content from me, you can always check out my Instagram and subscribe to my newsletter.